When we're going to look at, I'll just show you a bit of a shot of the current situation with the amount of nitrogen fixed by legumes in cropping systems in Australia. There's estimated 25 million hectares of legume-based pastures and crop legumes rotated with about 22 million hectares of cereals and oilseeds. I was unable to find these figures for South Africa, unfortunately, so just to give you an idea of the value, it's likely to be in the vicinity of 1.8 to 2.5 million tonne annually, and that's valued at between $35 and $47 billion annually, so a significant amount. Rhizobia are bacteria that live in the soil on plant roots and in legume nodules. They're also known as root nodule bacteria, and you'll sometimes see them referred to as RNB. And they form nodules on legume plants. When a legume seed germinates and the roots come out of the seed, they immediately start sending out pheromonic signals for Rhizobia of their type. At the same time, the Rhizobia are sending out signals for roots from plants of their type, and the Rhizobia, when the signals connect, the Rhizobia move towards the plant roots, and when they come in contact with a plant root, a microscopic root hair will wrap around that Rhizobia and hold it there to start the symbiotic process. The Rhizobia then absorb carbohydrate from the plant and in return fix atmospheric nitrogen for use by the plant to grow, and then later in this life cycle to set seed. Then when the plant senesces, the nitrogen that's been unused will remain in the soil for use by future crops. A lot of harsh environmental conditions will kill Rhizobia. High temperatures above 35 degrees will kill most Rhizobia. They're very sensitive to acidity and alkalinity, the different groups, and I'll show you more about that shortly. They're very sensitive to toxic chemicals, fungicides, solvents, alcohols and disinfectants all kill Rhizobia. And inorganic chemicals, high levels of heavy metals, zinc, copper, molybdenum, cobalt, all kill Rhizobia. So you've got to be very careful you don't mix treated seed with some of these things, and I know a lot of liquid fertiliser products will make claims that that's safe to mix with Rhizobia, but not with nitrogen fixing bacteria. Just the slightest trace of zinc or copper will kill them outright. One of the things I learnt when I was last in South Africa 2 years ago was that there seems to be not a great understanding of the necessity to have the right strain of Rhizobia with a particular crop that you sow. Rhizobia are host specific particularly, and you'll see here the different strains that are currently in all the inoculums produced in Australia. I haven't been able to find what strains are being used in South Africa, but certainly in a lot of cases these will be the strains being used. The AL group is for Lucerne, Strand and Disc-Medic, and that has one particular strain, a different one for the AM for all other medics. And then there's another same family of inoculum for Messina. Messina's a new salt-tolerant legume, salt and waterlogging tolerant legume, has recently been released in Australia. And for that salt-affected land, barley grass only country that gets very wet, it's quite a useful alternative. But the thing about it is it's the same family as the AM medic, and it's been no secret that in the past medics will grow under those, certainly under not the waterlogged conditions, but those saline barley grass only sites will grow medic, but the Rhizobia doesn't survive. So if you inoculate your medic with the Messina inoculum, you'll get a lot longer survival of the Rhizobia. The annual clovers, trifoliates, they all use the WSM 1325, which has been around now for 14 years in Australia. I'm not sure that it's in all the inoculum made here in South Africa, but it is a very good strain. I'll show you more about that shortly. And the perennial clovers, Group B, for white clover, strawberry clover. But I do know from experience here in South Africa that the Group C strain, the 1325, will nodulate white clover very well. So, but it won't on strawberry clover. Lupines and Ceradella are interchangeable with either the two strains mentioned here, and it's not many cases where they are interchangeable, but that's one. For some of the summer crop areas, cowpea is a CB 1015. Chickpea, there's a different strain. Bizarula has its own special strain. There are no native type Rhizobia that'll nodulate Bizarula in Australia, and I certainly doubt if there would be any here. So you really must use that strain. Field pea and vetch are the other, and favour bean, broad bean, lentil, they can use either strain, but it's better to grow peas with the E strain, peas and vetch, and favour beans, broad beans and lentils with the F strain. And again for the summer crop is soybean, Group H. So I just can't stress enough the importance of getting the grouping right for each species. The roads aren't that rough in Australia, and this road wasn't that bad either, but I do love the South African sense of humour. But this was a rough road in this trial where the wrong inoculum group was used across a multi-species trial due to some poor information given to the people doing the trial, and they just used Group C inoculum across all species. And in a paddock that had a background of subclover, you can see from the red arrow the subclover growing in the interrow is looking nice and healthy and dark green because it's responded to the fresh inoculation. The Bizarula in the rows, completely out of sorts, very pale in colour, not producing any nitrogen due to the not having its own specific strain of Rhizobia. It went on and set quite a lot of seed, but it just didn't flourish at all because it wasn't getting enough nitrogen throughout the year. This is a picture of a medic plant that we found. We dug up down near Esperance on the south coast where a lot of medic's grown. And I'll put it in for the benefit of the medic growers in the audience because we saw 2 years ago that a lot of medic wasn't nodulating very strongly in old stands in South Africa. This plant was over 1 metre across, but it's only, and we dug a big hole to get all the roots to see what the nodulation was like, and there wasn't a single nodule on the roots of this plant, but it was just growing on the residual nitrogen left from a previous cereal crop. So it's a net user of nitrogen, not a net producer of nitrogen. And that the other thing in cereal, in medic areas where there's a lot of medic grown, is a little grub called Setona Weevil, and that is like just a little white maggot you find in the root zones of medic plants, and it actually eats the nodules, and that's what it lives on. So it's worth having a look to see if you've got Setona Weevil in your medic paddocks, because it can do a lot of damage to your nitrogen fixation. As far as I know, the only solution is to have a longer cropping phase and try and run the medic numbers down, break the breeding cycle, and then start again. I mentioned the sensitivity of commonly grown pasture legumes and crop legumes to the soil pH, And that's a really critical, and almost as critical as having the right strain of inoculum. You can see from the green boxes here that that's the comfort zone where you get really good nitrogen fixation, because both the plant and the Rhizobia are comfortable. When you get into the yellow zone, it's where the Rhizobia start to function far less efficiently, and in the red zone they won't function at all. They just can't stand that type of atmosphere. So it's important to make sure you try and match that. I know it's difficult when you have areas of a camp that have got different pH, but you just have to. That's a case where you need to inoculate every 4 years at the most, to re-inoculate to get keep the numbers up in those areas. So what you need to look for to see if you're getting good results? Well, first thing you need to do is to dig the plant up. Don't pull it up. Dig it up, get plenty of soil with it, shake off the loose soil gently, and then wash the soil off the roots. So you get nice clean roots, you see all the nodules, and just see what is happening. This nodule you see here on the end of that scalpel, that's what you should see. Sometimes you'll see them a lot darker pink than that. That is, the darker the pink, the more efficient the nitrogen fixation. If you see green nodules, it's an indication that something's wrong. The Rhizobia is sick, or something's just upsetting them. Sometimes they'll get over that, but other times they won't, and the nodule will just drop off and you won't have any nitrogen fixation at all. Sometimes you'll find white nodules, and generally they are produced by non-nitrogen fixing Rhizobia, native Rhizobia in the soil that just don't fix any nitrogen. They just put a nodule there that goes along for the ride, doesn't contribute anything. And that's another reason why you need to inoculate on a consistently regular basis, so that you can keep the genetic purity of the Rhizobia, because they will cross with native Rhizobia in the soil and weaken their genetic purity, and you finish up with those white nodules. You need to keep the goodies outnumbering the baddies as well as you can, and that means inoculation on a regular basis. Later in the season, this pink nodule, as seed starts to go into reproductive stage, you will see a green ring around the outside of that nodule, and that's just an indicator that nitrogen's being drawn up in the plant to set seed. And when that's finished, the nodule will, and the plant senesces, and the season dries off, the nodule will slowly desiccate, and the Rhizobia go into dormant state in the soil. And that nitrogen that's left in that desiccated nodule will be plant available in future crops. Different types of legumes have different types of nodules. You'll see here you've got a Bizarula plant with a completely different nodule type. These grow like a bunch of grapes. These ones in particular are very fragile, and you need to be careful digging them up and washing the roots so you don't lose them. So you need to see how many nodules you've got there. But they are, this is an excellent nodulation. So Ron Yates at Murdoch University in Perth has developed this scoring chart. So when you've dug your plant up, washed the roots, you have a look compared to this chart and see where your plants sit, onto how many nodules they've got on the plant. You really want to have them as moderate, adequate or abundant, not in this side of the equation where they're scarce, rare, ineffective or absent. And you'd be amazed how many old stands of pasture fall into these first two categories. So you want to have plenty of good pink nodules, a mixture of big ones and small ones, and nodules forming at the top of the taproot, like you see on the abundant here. They are the most efficient nodules, are the ones closer to the top. I spoke earlier about the specificity of nodulation and fixation. These 3 slides here show 8 pots of sterile beads with 8 different clover species growing in them. And the only difference between these 3 lots is the strain of Rhizobia being used. So as new strains are being found to try and improve performance, they're introduced into the system. Between post-2004, there was 2 new clover species being prepared for release, bladder clover and gland clover, and they didn't nodulate efficiently with the WSM 409. So the Centre for Rhizobia Studies had to find another strain for them and then make sure that performed well on all the other clovers that were already in the system. This WSM 1325 was released in 2006 and goes through till now in all products in Australia, and it would be worth trying to find out if they are in your products available here in South Africa, but I haven't been able to find that out. But the only difference between the left-hand slide and the right-hand slide is just the strain of Rhizobia. So you've got probably 30 to 50% increase in productivity just through the strain of Rhizobia. So it's important to try and get this into any stands of clover, including white clover, to get a lot better nitrogen fixation. And it's important that happens, and there are different ways you can do that. Inoculation is required whenever a legume hasn't been previously grown in the paddock, or it's been more than 4 years since that's happened. You need to keep your eye open for newly selected strains that have that increased effectiveness, like we've just seen, and then you can get them into the system. The presence of acidic or highly alkaline soils in the paddock may limit the survival of Rhizobia in the soil. But the paddock if it's subjected to particularly hot, dry summers, like you have in the Western Cape and we have in Australia, some of the strains don't survive all that well in their desiccated state if the ground's too hot. And it particularly applies to the strain used on peas. So work's being done in Australia now to get a better strain of inoculum for peas to be able to grow it in the hotter soils, and B, for it to be able to grow in more acidic soils. And the other one is if the legume's got specific rhizobial requirements and won't nodulate with any background, such as lotus, bizarula or sulla. So the most common way of inoculating seed has been with a peat inoculant. That system's been around for 60 years or more. And to do that, you need to use an adhesive solution, which needs to be dissolved in boiling water. So you need to do that in advance so it can cool down before you start making up your slurry. You must use clean, potable water. If you can't do that, you're running the risk of killing a lot of the Rhizobia. But water needs to be clean, not just any old water, and particularly not chlorinated water. So you make up your slurry, you mix it up with the seed, you put it on the seed in a cement mixer or something similar on the floor of the shed, and just turn it over with shovels, and that gives a good coverage on the seed. You can add some fine ground lime, calcium carbonate, not builder's lime or any other type of lime, but just this fine ground calcium carbonate, which I know is available in South Africa, and sprinkle that over the seed. That's got several purposes, one of which it stops the seed sticking together in lumps. It helps to dry the seed out. It provides a neutral zone when seed germinates around the root system, and it does help to preserve the Rhizobia. But these once you treat a seed with peat, you need to get it in the ground into moist soil as quickly as possible. When you treat a seed with peat, about 90% of the Rhizobia die within the first 24 hours of application, if it's not in the ground. But because you're dealing in billions, there's still plenty left. But 90% of what's left die every 24 hours after that. So if for some reason you inoculate the seed, have a machinery breakdown or bad weather comes in, you can't sow for a few days, you really should go back and do it again. So you need to get that seed into moist soil. I can't emphasise that strongly enough, that moisture is the key thing to keep them alive. And it's no good top dressing that seed out on top of the ground with the intention of harrowing it in or getting into the ground somehow that way, because wind and sun are very, very quick to kill Rhizobia. So if looking at the bottom slide here, if you've done your subclover, for example, the little sample on the left hasn't got wet enough for the lime to stick, so that the seed wasn't wet enough, so you've got a lot of seeds there that aren't coated. The one on the right had got a bit too wet and started making lumps when the lime went in, and that's too much in the middle. It's just right. They just want to be white, not too much lime. You only need about 2.5 kilos to a 25 kilo bag, but if you get too much and make it look nice and white and pristine, when it dries, most of that lime will fall off and cause bridging problems in your sowing machinery, and you don't want to have that. The lupins in the top right-hand corner, on the right you've got uninoculated lupins, on the left you've got lupins that have been inoculated up an auger. You get the flow rate of your auger right going into the truck, get the flow rate of your, just drill a hole in the outside of the auger and poke a little hose in there and feed the inoculum in. Get your flow rates right. That's really easy, but just be careful you don't use too much sticker. But certainly in Australia, all the grain legume inoculums have got the sticker in them, so that people don't make the mistake of putting too much and then having it set like a brick in the back of the truck. One of the other products in Australia, and no doubt you will maybe have some of these here now, or you will have them soon, are granules, which can be just mixed with the seed. There's 3 types. There's a attapulgite granule, peat granules, which are just compressed granules of the peat product, and bentonite granules. The attapulgite and the peat granules are moist granules and still need to be handled with care, not refrigerated but kept cool. The bentonite granules are a dry granule and just have to be kept dry. And the bentonite granule can be mixed with seed that's been treated with a fungicide or insecticide, and can be mixed for a short period with fertiliser, because the Rhizobia are actually inside the granule and protected by the outside of the granule protects them. The others can't be mixed with fungicides, insecticides and fertilisers. They need to be put they're best to be put in the furrow alongside the seed. So if they can be mixed with the seed, is the ideal way to do it. But they just need to be close. A technique discovered by a farmer in New South Wales. He tried in 2013, when he sowed a wheat crop, he put the dry Alaska granules Bizarula strain in with his fertiliser, because he intended to sow Bizarula in that paddock the following year. And all the strains used in Australia have been selected to make sure they have what is known as saprophytic competence. This means that the inoculum is put in the ground, the Rhizobia can multiply and build up numbers without a host plant. and that's really important because you can get a lot more numbers in a paddock by giving them 12 months to build up numbers. You'll get more than you will by putting it on the seed the year you sow. So he sowed this paddock to wheat with the Bizarula granules, and he ran out with one round of the air seeder to go, and so you've got this strip up here on the left-hand side. It's all nice and green, nodulating well. On the right, it's pale yellow without any nodules at all. The following February, he sowed the Bizarula dry and didn't have to worry about Inoculum, of course, and this was the result. So you've got a clear message there that system worked. The following year, he couldn't get the granules in time when he wanted to sow his wheat, so he inoculated the wheat with peat of the BS strain and sowed that, and then sowed the Bizarula in February 2015. And you can see from this picture here that's nodulated really well. So again, it worked that way. But he had no fungicide on the wheat, and that worked okay. And for those of you doing the cover cropping system, it's a good opportunity to get fresh inoculum in by putting it on the seed of whatever you're sowing the previous year before you're going back to pasture or going to another crop. Another product on the market in Australia is freeze-dried inoculum, and these little vials you see here of this freeze-dried paste, that is, those vials will do between either 25 or 500, or between 25 and 500 kilos of seed, depending on which seed they're for, the group's for. And there's a packet of a protecting agent comes with it. So to use this, you just take the cap off, add a bit of water to get that back into a liquid form in the bottle, empty it into the measured amount of clean water, add the protecting agent, and then either put it in a liquid cart to put down the liquid system, or put it on the seed. It can't be seed treated with this, can't come in contact with the chemicals or fertiliser, and if you're putting it into a liquid cart, it really has to be clean enough for you to be confident to drink the water out of the cart. This seed treated this way needs to be sown within 5 hours, again into moist soil. Liquid inoculants you'll be more familiar with, particularly in the summer cropping areas, summer rainfall areas where it's commonly used with soybeans, and mostly used down the liquid, through the liquid carts and injected into the soil, and again a very efficient way to do it. One of the other things we see now is a lot of pre-coated, pre-inoculated seed. We see there's a lot of that on the market in Australia, but even though it's been there for quite some time now, the success rate or the survival rate of Rhizobia in this system is pretty poor. And an example here is Semitic sown with coated seed, and you've just got one walnut type nodule on each plant, and there's nothing at all on the rest of the roots. This is called compensatory nodulation, where you get, with low Rhizobia numbers, you'll get one big nodule like that. It's better than no nodules at all, but it should be producing a lot more than that. Testing done by the Grains and Research and Development Corporation, with samples bought from retail outlets throughout Australia, between 1999 and 2005, haven't been impressive by any means. Lucerne AL group is one that does survive time reasonably well in a coated seed situation, but none of the others, in my opinion, are successful enough. And in 2005, only 5% of the samples tested passed, which means they've got a minimum of 1,000 cells per seed. And Rhizobia was detected in 60% of the samples and none whatsoever in 40% of the samples. And given that in a lot of cases you have a size increase, a weight increase of between 30 and right up as much as 100% weight increase with the coating, it's not a very good buy for the grower, even though it seems like it might make life easier. And this again is a bit more information on how the life is quite short. You know, you've got 50 days. You've only got one sample there that was older than 50 days from testing that passed the minimum standard here at 1,000 cells per seed. So beware of coated seed. It's not the answer. I strongly recommend to you this inoculation guide, which is available on the GRDC website, which is shown there under publications on that website. It was prepared out of a 5-year project that we had in Australia to promote inoculation, and it has been the biggest singly printed production that the Grains Research and Development Corporation have done, and is about to go into another print run, and then it will be revised and updated in the next 12 months. There's also on that same site, you'll find a back pocket guide, which is a small fold-out publication that would fit in the glove box of your backie or carry around with you, that gets all the key issues out of this book and puts it into an easy-to-carry production. So in conclusion, I'd say that the inoculation is very cheap, and if it's done correctly, it's a very efficient way of producing nitrogen. You must follow the instructions for the product used. They're on the packets, and although men aren't generally known to be good at following instructions, I strongly urge you to do that. The instructions have been developed over a long period of time, and if you stick to the letter of the instructions, you won't go wrong. It's important to match the groups to the legume being grown, not just any old inoculum. You need to make sure you've got the right group. Avoid those sensitivities, especially things like pH and herbicide residues, which you'll learn more about later. But the important thing I say is learn to assess what's happening under the ground. It's really important. You can sometimes see that there's nothing happening with the colour of a legume above the ground, but growth above the ground will happen almost always. But if you're growing a legume and it's not producing nitrogen, it's just not efficient and not effective. So always dig plants up, wash the soil off the roots, and have a good look at the nodules, assess what colour they are, try and work out how you would rank them on a nodule score. It's quite easy to learn how to do that. Teach yourself and it doesn't take long to do it. So in closing on this section, I'd just like to acknowledge Dr. Johann Strauss for his assistance, and Murdoch University Professors John Howison, Graham O'Hara, Brad Nutt, and Dr. Ron Yates and Rob Harrison, and from the Department of Primary Industry Research and Development, Regional Development, Dr. Angelo Loy. Thank you. This talk is entitled, Do You Need to Add Nitrogen If You've Already Done a Good Job of Growing It? I'll take you through some examples of how easy it is to grow your own nitrogen. Some of the pasture species used in Western Australia for doing this job are Bizarula, hard-seeded French Cerridella similar to your Emina, but with 90% hard seed. Bladder clover, which if Peter Swartz in the audience who would recognise this is grown on his farm at Caledon. And again, I love this South African sense of humour, and here we've got we'll go through the good news. Nitrogen. How much does X legume fix? Is it enough for a crop? Can I grow more than one crop? Are they all the same? Well, subclover has about 2 to 2.5% nitrogen, Ceradella 3 to 3.5%, Bizarula 4 to 4.5%. Mark Peoples and others worked out a formula some years ago that 20 kilograms of urea per tonne of dry matter of a pasture legume produced will be available in the next year. So 5 tonne of dry matter, which is less than you see in this picture here in the background, of Bizarula, 30% or about 100 kilos of urea per hectare would be available for crop in year 1, another 100 in year 2, another 100 in year 3. But the rider is that as long as the legume is well nodulated. So a set of trials were set up to investigate the response for wheat and barley to organic nitrogen from these crops. And I've put figures on there of the cost of the nitrogen, the urea used in the 4 different treatments along with the control. And if there's no difference in the response, it just means there's no need for extra nitrogen. And those figures are ran cost of urea plus delivery and spreading. First trial done at Brookton, just east of Perth. After 2012, a really good stand of French Ceradella, Margarita French Ceradella, and a maize wheat crop was sown, and with no nitrogen, yielded 5 tonne to the hectare, no extra cost. Plots were applied at 50 kilos, 100 kilos, 150 and 200 kilos of urea. And you can see from this here that the only one that out-yielded the nil was 150 kilos of urea, and it's hard to imagine the 878 Rand extra cost would be paid for by the extra 400 kilos of wheat. In Chapman Valley, up near Geraldton, Bizarula in 2015, followed by wheat in 2016. Here again, we've got only a marginal increase with 50 kilos of urea, which has cost 270 Rand for 100 kilos of wheat, and the others aren't any better. So another good case. So that's all right for one crop. What happens when you grow 2 and 3 crops? So here again at the same farm at Chapman Valley, after Bizarula in 2014, he followed that with canola and then wheat in 2016. Now the wheat in 2016 following canola, the best yield was still with no nitrogen. The applied nitrogen produced lower yields and a lot lower profit. Then it looked at another paddock on the same farm where he grew Bizarula in 2013, followed that by oats, then canola, then wheat. And the only plot here that responded was with 200 kilos of urea to gain an extra 400 kilos of wheat. So I don't think 1,168 Rand would cover the cost of doing that. The Scadden down near Esperance with Medics, which is familiar to a lot more of the audience, I would think. 2015 Medics, 2016 wheat. 4.6 tonnes with no nitrogen and lower yields with more nitrogen. Again, the most profitable would have been nil. Same farm at Scadden after Medic in 2013, he grew wheat, barley. The barley in 2016, again the top yield was no nitrogen. Took this a step further and did a case study on a farm at Lake King, about 2/3 of the way between Perth and Esperance. This was summer sowing of Margarita French Ceradella, sown in February with pod, sown dry. A technique used in Australia with Margarita French Ceradella pod and bladder clover unscarified seed. Sow it in February. There's three things that break down the dormancy of hard seed. One is time, the other is darkness, and the third is the day-night temperature fluctuations. 60-degree daytime temperature, 15-degree nighttime temperature, up and down like that for a period of time breaks the dormancy and gives you about 300% more dry matter production when it does germinate compared to stuff sown 2 or 3 weeks after the break once you've had a weed control. Uses Amazothapia and propizamide post-sowing pre-emergent to control broadleaves, weeds and grasses. This paddock was grazed with sheep. Grazing cages were put in and it produced 10 tonne to the hectare where it was ungrazed. And here, when this photo was taken, there was 5 tonne to the hectare where it was grazed. A weed wiper was used in spring to control the radish that escaped the chemical. So in that paddock, 3 large plots were marked out. One was left as is, one was sprayed out early after emergence and sprayed again to keep in the fallow, and another plot was left and brown manured, sprayed at flowering time to kill the plants off so they didn't take any of the nitrogen up into the seed production. And then the following year, when the canola was sown, they had 3 treatments of nitrogen, of urea, at 0, 25 units of nitrogen, 50 units of nitrogen, 75 units of nitrogen, and the cost of doing that along the bottom. The canola grew that year. Variety was Yetna, which is tolerant of IMI residues. It had 15 units of N in the sowing fertiliser, compound fertiliser. Growing season rainfall was 174 millimetres. The annual rainfall was 350, and you can see it grew a nice healthy canola crop. This was an aerial shot from the drone just when the canola started flowering, and you can see the fallow certainly isn't performing all that well with the canola. A lot of pretty ordinary density there, but the brown manure and the Ceradella run through to harvest is okay. So when these canola plots were harvested, the average of the whole paddock was 1.6 tonnes to the hectare with 44.6% oil. And you can see here from this graph, the blue is no nitrogen through to yellow at 75 kilos. On the fallow, there was definitely a response to the higher rates of nitrogen, but on the harvested Ceradella and the brown manured Ceradella, the yields were almost the same as 75 kilos of N, 150 kilos of urea on these plots. So it did its job. Another interesting thing with these deep-rooted species like Ceradella, it's long been believed that they actually bring a lot of nutrients back to the surface through their root system that are out of the reach of most other pasture plants, and this certainly proved to be the case. Where on the fallow plot, you can see the rate of potassium in the soil test was 44 at 0 to 10 centimetres, and in the Ceradella plot it was 78 units or parts per million. So it's certainly done that. So you can do it, and I strongly urge you to give it a lot of thought. If you are game to do a whole paddock, a whole camp like that, and you still feel you should put some nitrogen on, leave some untreated strips. Leave boom spray widths that you can run your header down and measure with the header whether you've done the right thing or not. The whole nitrogen fixation argument is a strong one. You do need rain, and you need rain early to speed up the nitrification of that soil stored nitrogen, and your crops may look a bit light on early, but once you get that rain and that nitrogen becomes available, it's there when the plant requires it, not like a little shot of drug to give the plant a shot, and then they want the hand out wanting some more. In closing, again, I'd just like to acknowledge Dr. Johann Strauss and his assistants, the Centre for Rhizobia Studies at Murdoch University, Professors Howison, O'Hara, Nutt, and Dr. Ron Yates and Rob Harrison, and from the Department of Primary Industry and Regional Development, Dr. Angelo Loy. Thank you. I'd like to talk now about the effect of herbicide residues on nitrogen fixation. It's an issue that's being very closely looked at in Australia at the moment, and already some good work's been done just to demonstrate that things are happening post cropping phases, cereal phases in particular, with the herbicides used on those crops and their effect in the soil, and the biggest effect appears to be on nitrogen fixation. Dr. Ron Yates at Murdoch University and Department of Agriculture at that time decided to, after seeing some field work showing there was effects of SU herbicide residues, did a trial by trying to simulate residues at different levels and preparing soil and sowing subclover into it. Using trisulfuron, or Logran as we know it, and from the left, the standard rate is 30 grams per hectare, recommended rate, and from the left we've got a tenth of the standard rate at 1/10, 3 grams. Then diluted that down to 1/100th, 1/1000th, 1/10,000th, and 1/100,000th of the recommended rate, and a control plant on the right with none. After 18 days growth, you can see massive differences here, and the effect that those residues have had on the formation of the roots and nodulation. With regard to nodulation, the plant on the right, the control plant, has started to nodulate. There's no nodules at all on any of the other plants, and the further left you go on this slide, the more root damage, and again a lot less because it hasn't got roots to take up nutrition. You've got a lot less growth above the ground, and plants that are obviously stressed going by the colour of their leaves and stems. So it doesn't take much to do a lot of damage, in this case with the fixation. Now you may remember back in the early previous talk about how the Rhizobia go to the roots when they germinate out of the seed, and then a root hair will wrap around that Rhizobia and hold it onto the root to start the symbiotic process. Well, the mode of action of SU herbicides is to strip the root hairs off, strip a lot of the roots off, and kill a plant that way. And so if you haven't got the root hairs and root systems there, you can't start nodulation. It's as simple as that. Another different situation of a soil type in up near Southern Cross in the Eastern Wheat Belt in Western Australia, where a farmer had a massive 800 hectare camp that he had wanted to take out of a cropping system, been cropped consecutively for years, and put it to pasture because he had weed resistance problems. And he he asked a few of us at a field day if we could have a look at it and see what we'd recommend for him to plant. Now, in the soil pH and the soil type, rainfall type, the plants planted, these ones planted here would be the ones that you'd normally recommend. But when we asked him about his fertiliser cropping history, chemical history, he'd used 30 grams a low gram every year for the last 8 years. So we immediately suspected that they might be compromised to grow a legume. So the soil, we took samples of the soil and it went back to South Perth to the Ag Department, and they grew these in the greenhouse in these tubs and use Angel Medic as a control, because Angel Medic is a strand medic tolerant of SU residues, sulfonylurea residues, and is always used as a control in these sort of bioassays. And you can see here that that's quite happy in this environment. All these other plants are really suffering, and 2 weeks after this photo was taken, all these other tubs were dead and the Angel was still going strong. So it would have been a very expensive exercise, $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 worth of seed to sow a paddock that size, and would have all been a total waste if he'd just gone ahead and sown what he could get out of this group. One of the problems that comes with herbicide residues is people not reading the label on the chemicals they're using. You may not have any choice that you might have to use that chemical to kill the weeds that you want to kill and so on, but you really need to understand that there are two things. There's a replanting interval of months, and that's providing you got the minimum amount of rainfall in that period to break down the chemical residue and make it safe to plant these crops into. Pyroxasulfone, which is we know as Sakura, a new grass selective in wheat. For a lot of these things, you've got 9 to 21 months replanting period and 250 to 550 millimetres of rainfall. Well, it's used in Australia. It's used in a lot of areas that are only average 300 millimetres, if that. So to be growing Durham wheat, oats, lucerne and medic, you want at least 2 years to get enough rainfall to break it down. So the team from Murdoch University set up a trial in 2012 just out of Perth at Brookton in an existing wheat crop. They marked out the plot area, pegged it all out, then sprayed this way across the plot with these chemicals. So we had chlorpyrrolid, which is known as Lontril, pyroxasulfone, Sakura, chlorsulfuron, Glean, trisulfuron, Logran, and a control. And 3 replications. And after that was applied in the wheat, obviously the pyroxasulfone is supposed to be incorporated, but it couldn't be. So I had to rely on rainfall incorporation. So in November 2012, February 2013, May 2013, core samples were taken out of these plots and taken back to Murdoch University to grow subclover in them to see what the sensitivity was to the residues. And then in late May 2013, the group of legumes on the left was sown into this trial, going from right to left across all these treatments, and we'll show you some of the results. These subclovers that were grown in the cores, these ones were taken in February 2013, and so now you're 8 months after the spraying was done, and you can see the trisulfuron or Glean was Logran was still impacting the seeds. You compare them to the control in the middle. The pyroxasulfone, the Sakura, wasn't showing much effect because it hadn't been incorporated, only by a small amount of rainfall. The Glean, chlorsulfuron, obviously having an impact, and so was the chlorpyrrolid or Lontrol. But that site, in the springtime, it was very difficult to see any effect. These herbicides had been sprayed across the plot from left to right. You look down those rows, Ceradella on the left-hand side, then bladder clover. The lupins, there's a little patch there of lupins being a bit thinner, but that was just a germination issue. But there's no visible damaging signs above the ground. Those trials in those tubs there were this is the results of that over the 3 samplings. How many months showing there from when the application was done, 4, 7 and 10. And you can see that the effect of the herbicides on the dry shoot and dry matter weight. The one that does stand out as not having much effect at all is the first 2 samples on the Sakura, because there was very little rainfall before February 2013, but once it started raining after that, you started to see the effect of the damage. So then we look at 13 months after application and look at the reduction in nodulation when compared to the control. The unsprayed control is 100%, and the different colour bars are the different species, and these are the different herbicides that were along the bottom that were across them. So you can see from there that there's at best 50% loss, 45 to 50% loss of nodulation, right down to nearly 100% with the Sakura on peas. So there's it's very clear that the effect that these have had 13 months after application. So in some cases you need a lot. We clearly didn't have enough rainfall in that period and didn't have enough time. Another trial on Urana subclover, in Narrogin, where I live, where a lot of commonly used pasture herbicides were used on subclover, and it had a lot of them had a fairly significant effect. The right-hand column is the dry weight, the dry matter production, and the percentage of control. So you can see the impact they had on the dry matter production in the growing season. And the nodulation score, it was only imazamox and imazethapyr that would pass muster in terms of little effect on the nodulation. But there's certainly some of the more commonly used ones were very hard on the resultant nodulation. So in summary, I just really need to point out the growers must adhere to the recommended plant back periods. You know the plant back period on the chemical, and that you know what happens when you mix 2 or 3 chemicals together. You really there's not enough knowledge of what happens, the synergistic effect of different chemicals mixed together, what effect they have on the plants growing and on the nitrogen fixation. It's really critical that you keep documentation of what and when and where when you are using the chemicals, because of fast developing control methods or to trace back methods. You have to keep these records, so it's important that you do, because You can't blame the chemical company if things go wrong, if it was on the label or you haven't sprayed it in the right conditions. All chemicals, apart from handling them, you've got to take a lot of care spraying them throughout the whole farm system rotation and address plant-back periods from all angles. And we don't know enough about the effect of insecticides and fungicides yet either. Growers can benefit a lot from more information on herbicide effectiveness, but it's an expensive process doing all this trial work, and not many companies put their hand up to do it. It's the penalties you get on nitrogen fixation can have a significant effect on your farming system, because healthy legumes equal a healthy farming system. I'll just close on relating to a story about traceability. 3 years ago, tomato farmers in Japan were reporting that their tomatoes were suddenly dying. Tomatoes were being fertilised with dung from a cattle feedlot. They were able to trace the feed, the hay that was being fed to those cattle had come from Victoria and Australia. And through the tracing system that exists on those sort of products now, they were able to trace that hay back to the farm it was grown on, inspected the spraying records for that farm, and it was found that oat and hay was sprayed with Lontrel, chlorpyrrolid. Now that residue stayed in the hay all the way through to when it was fed out to the cattle, and it's passed through the cattle in the dung, went out to be put on the tomatoes and killed the tomatoes. So there's more risk associated with other things further down the track than what happens on your farm. Thank you.